Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our contra-current discussions. Today we have a special guest from UK, actually. That's why we are speaking in English today. Is Vladimir Borțun. Welcome, Vladimir.
Hi, comrades. Thank you for having me. And I'm Romanian, but we agreed to discuss in English, so we have a hopefully wider international audience.
Yes. Vladimir is a political scientist. He's a postdoctoral researcher at Oxford University, where he's studying the class origin of the British elites. This is a very interesting subject. And he's also working on a program of research on the relations between the capitalist fractions and the right populism. Was that correct?
Yeah.
So far?
Yeah.
And he's also specialized in trans-nationalism, European Left, and the European Union. His last book, Crisis, Austerity, and the Transnational Party Cooperation in Southern Europe, The Radical Left's Lost Decade, was published at Palgrave Macmillan. He's also an activist, member of the Romanian Socialist Action Group, and member of Internationalist Standpoint. Welcome, Vladimir.
Welcome, Florin and Marius.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, how long you've been a active leftist, let's say like this? So to take like a history of your battle on the front.
Well, I consider myself a Marxist since the age of 14 when I read the Communist Manifesto the first time. And then I remember, because, you know, Romania in the 90s, growing up in the 90s was a complete ideological desert in the sense that it was completely dominated by various right-wing ideologies. There was no space for left-wing articulations in the public space. So I think the first website in in Romania that hosted some kind of left-wing discourse was Indymedia Romania. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It was the Romanian branch or section of Indymedia, which was this kind of transnational online platform of what we could call the anti-globalization left of the late 90s. And it had sections in different languages, and the Romanian section was, I believe, the first kind of post-89 type of outlet in Romanian that published some kind of left-wing anti-capitalist discourses. And I remember writing there my first article ever on Romania's participation in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and neo-colonial relations between Romania and the United States that underlie that kind of participation. And it was a very crude analysis, but that marked my first public intervention, if you want, from
yeah, I think we can say that not much has changed since then. Well, we can talk about this. Actually, this I think would be a good starting point for our discussion of the left. What is left of the left today? To say it like this, how been transformed, and if there is any correspondence between the left today and the left, let's say 50 years ago, not necessarily the Romanian left. I think we can make a separation between the left in Eastern Europe, which would be, I think the Eastern European is different from the Western European, has this experience of a socialist, which Western European doesn't. So what would be this transformation? What is left today compared to the left 50 years ago?
big question. I would say we cannot understand this transformation of the left if we don't place it in the broader context of the last 45 years of neoliberalism. It's a big historical process that we're still part of. And it meant several things, connected processes, interrelated processes that have affected the left. The decline of Keynesian economic consensus after the Second World War, which was a social democratic consensus that both center-left and center-right parties supported for maybe 30 years after the Second World War, which saw the biggest expansion of let's say, quasi-generalized prosperity in Western European societies, workers' rights, welfare state, relatively safe and well-paid employment. It's a golden era of capitalism in a way. And it was in spite of capitalism. It was a period where capitalism had to make big concessions to the working classes for several reasons. I don't think we have time now to go into them, but the decline of this post-war consensus paved the way for the rise of neoliberalism. This meant also the decline of the industrial working class, which was the core of the social base of the left. The industrial workers were the most mobilized, most militant, most unionized, most likely to join political parties or agitate for political left parties. The miners, the dockers, steel workers, and so on. We also saw the changes in capitalism, the financialization of capitalism, which was the twin process of this decline of industry in Western societies. We saw the globalization of capitalism. And then in '89, we saw the fall of the state socialist regimes in Eastern Europe and then Soviet Union, which had many defects and things to criticize about. But the fall of these regimes meant that the rising ideology of neoliberalism became even more hegemonic. There was no rival. There was no alternative, no Thatcher's famous phrase. Neoliberalism was the only game in town, as they say. So this fall of the socialist regimes paved the way for the hegemonic paradigm of neoliberalism. And then on the left, because of these processes, we saw a moderation and a shift to the center of both the reformist left and the radical left. And the reformist left became neoliberal, and the radical left became reformist. And part of this process, we also saw an infiltration of petite bourgeois individualist ideas in the radical left, postmodern ideas that came to prominence on the background of the decline in the popularity of Marxist ideas, of materialist, historical materialist ideas. So yeah, it's all this process that has seen, basically, to sum up, a shift to the right, at least on economic issues, which as a good materialist, I think, are the most important, of the whole ideological spectrum. This includes the radical left that also moved towards the center, and as I said, has become what I would call today the neo-reformist left.
Well, it would be interesting to see if this shift was driven by some, let's say, some elite of the left, like leadership who was disconnected from the public, or been driven by actually, I don't know, expectation, the level of the general public of Europe. So was it driven by the people of Europe, or by some elite disconnected from the will of the people?
I think both. And the historical processes that I outlined earlier focus on the structural factors. But we know there's always an interdependency between structure and agency. between objective factors and subjective factors. And in this case, the subjective factors include the leadership and the consciousness of the people, what you say, what the public wants, no? And consciousness, class consciousness and political consciousness was pushed back by the rise of neoliberalism, by the fall of the socialist regimes. And of course, the new hegemonic paradigm of neoliberalism used all the channels possible to impose its new orthodoxy on people's consciousness through education, through culture, through the media, mainstream media. They've all delivered this message about the superiority of the free market, the superiority of private enterprise, how we are all individualists, this is human nature. You know, all this discourse that legitimizes neoliberal policies has been fed to us for decades. So this also has a major role in what Marx called the false consciousness, no? Undermining class consciousness, by which the working class becomes not just a class in itself, but also a class for itself, that is aware of its own interests and the need to fight in a collective way. But also the leadership problem. I mean, the history of the left is marked by betrayals of leaders, of the leadership, starting with the Second International, no? And how the majority of the leadership of the Second International, particularly of the French and the German parties, joined their governments in the imperialist war of 1914, 1918, betraying all the principles of socialism and internationalism. It was a betrayal that was then repeated many times in history by leaderships of both reformist and radical / communist parties. The truth is that communist party, leadership of communist parties many times acted as a brake on a revolutionary pressure coming from below. Thinking here at Spain, 1936, and the role of the Spanish Communist Party there, that I acted as a counter-revolutionary force under the orders from Moscow, from Stalin. Thinking of May 68 in France, where again the Communist Party acted as a counter-revolutionary force, unfortunately, and many other examples, where the leadership, which is enjoying certain benefits under capitalism. No, Lenin called them the labor aristocracy. Leaders of trade unions, leaders of social democratic parties, and in some cases even of communist parties, they derive some benefits, some material privileges from this current order, from the status quo. So they are the least motivated to actually significantly challenge the status quo. So they will play at two heads, as they say. Leaderships are always to be, you know, not mistrusted, but kept kept accountable by the rank and file. And this is a big problem of the left, this lack of democracy from below, where the leadership is actually accountable to the rank and file. So yeah, and combined with that, we have seen a change, because you mentioned that I'm researching class origins of elites. There's a change in the kind of social background of left-wing leaders in the last few decades. We very rarely see today leaders of left parties coming from a working class background, like you used to have back in the day, you know, miners or rank and file trade unionists who would go up the hierarchy and become trade union leaders or even political leaders. Famous example, I don't know, Dennis Skinner in the UK. He was a miner before he became a member of parliament. These people don't exist anymore. The leaders of the left parties and even of the trade unions tend to come from middle class background, from the so-called professional managerial class, not from the working class. So this is another significant development that happened over the past few decades.
I remember an interview with former President Mujica of Uruguay, who was saying that his greatest regret, if I remember correctly, his greatest regret at the end of his mandate was that the people who he helped rise from poverty become kind of bourgeois. So instead of helping those left behind, because not everybody was raised from poverty, they become middle class. I mean, people with middle class expectations and getting richer and this stuff. So class consciousness is something. It's a tricky thing. How was that saying from Zizek? It's easier to see the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I think was the quote.
Yeah.
Probably, I don't know. You had a conference, I think, some time ago about what is beyond capitalism, right?
Yeah.
So can we imagine something? I think, like you said about, okay, elites are following their interests. It's now not something to question about. But at the level of the people, do you think we can still envision something beyond capitalism? Can we dream, or let's say just envision something, or is it just nothing? So we just accept capitalism because there's nothing beyond it.
It's easy to fall in the trap of this pessimism, I think. And that's what capitalist ideology wants us to do, to convince us that it's the only way, that it's the natural order, that corresponds the most to human nature. Now, capitalism is a match to the human nature, so how people really are, that capitalism has proved itself more efficient than other systems, and that nothing better has been created than capitalism, and so on and so forth. And of course, nothing better is created until it is created. That's how progress works. You try a few times and you may fail, but you don't stop trying. Capitalism didn't replace feudalism overnight. It wasn't a smooth, peaceful transition from feudalism to capitalism. It took centuries. It's even today you have still elements of feudalism, especially in terms of social relations in many parts of the world. It's predominantly a capitalist world we live in, but there are elements of feudalism that are surviving after centuries of capitalism. Capitalism took many revolutions, counter-revolutions, civil wars, colonial wars, imperialist wars to establish its expansion and domination over the world. So why would it be different in transitioning from capitalism to another society, you know? I think we will. I think we will, and maybe many years from now, when we will be living in a post-capitalist society, we will be looking back at this century of 20th century and beginning of 21st century as the same kind of long-term historical process that took us from capitalism to a post-capitalist society, similarly to the way we look now today at the long century, several century long process that took us from feudalism to capitalism. And we have to have this long-term perspective. Otherwise, we won't see a way out of the current situation, which is pretty depressing. But we need to take this longer-term perspective. I mean, take feudalism, no? Roughly speaking, it started around year 500, and it ended, or the beginning of the end starts in the 1600 rural England, where the first capitalist production relations emerged. So feudalism lasted for 1,000 years. Many people probably believe that feudalism was the only way possible, was the only system, was the best system possible. And it was a better system, a better social and economic system than the one previous to it, the slavery society. And it lasted for 1,000 years. Doesn't mean it was the best that human progress could achieve. Why would we believe today about capitalism, that capitalism is the last stage of human progress? I don't think so. I think we can do better than capitalism. But of course, the ideologues of capitalism and the people who benefit the most from capitalism want to convince us otherwise, that it's not possible, that this is the only way forward. So I think we need to resist that and dismantle this naturalization of capitalism as the only way possible, and stand our ground that not only alternative post-capitalist societies are possible, but they are necessary, because otherwise we won't have a future on this planet.
Yeah, I would ask you to advance a bit, but I would add first that this transition you said about was actually a transition between elites, because it wasn't a revolution of people who wanted capitalism. It was actually a transition from one elite, the feudalist elite, to the capitalist elite. So usually these great transitions are made by those with power. It's actually a decision above us. We might have expectations, but what will be delivered to us might not depend on us. And that's what I think we have to be questionable about. How much the present elites want to change, because if they'll change, they'll do it in their own interest, not our interest. So this would be something to think about. And also, I think every class, even the feudalist class, the aristocracy, and everybody had inertia, so a kind of protecting their own interest. So how far would capitalist elites would go to protect against the change in their order, against losing their privileges and all their political power that they have? Well, I don't know. Can we imagine?
No, we can't, because like Engels said, no ruling class ever left the stage of history on its own accord. It was always forced by insurgent social forces to exit the stage and leave room for other social classes to take its place. And how far capitalist elites are willing to go to preserve their system, we can see it before our eyes. The destruction of the planet, war, inequality, poverty, precarity, and we can look at the rise of authoritarian regimes in so-called Western democracies. We see an increased authoritarianism in terms of clamping down on basic civil freedoms and individual liberties that capitalism is supposed to protect. Now, that's one of the arguments for capitalism, that it's a better system at protecting individual liberties and human rights. And we see capitalist regimes clamping down on those rights precisely to protect its interests. But the best answer to that is looking back at the fascist regimes. Capitalist elites are happy to employ fascism as a last resort in order to preserve the capitalist order. And fascists came to power in Italy and Germany 90 years ago or even longer, because the capitalist class was in a deadlock. It couldn't defeat a still very strong working class that was very militant and politically conscious and organized at the time in both Italy and Germany, where there had been revolutionary situations just a few years before fascists seized powers. And despite the fact the working class didn't seize those moments, it was still very strong. It was still posing a big danger to the capitalist order. So the ruling class at the time realized that they could not defeat the working class through the framework of liberal democracy, through elections, through parliamentary politics. And also there was an internal war within the capitalist class in both cases, Italy and Germany, where there was a struggle for hegemony between different factions of the capitalist class, where particularly the financial faction of the capitalist class needed to exert domination over the other factions, the industrial faction, the agricultural faction, in the case of Germany, which was still a very strong agricultural country, or in Italy, where the south was very agricultural, and the north had to impose its hegemony over the landowners in the south. And this could also not be resolved through the framework of liberal democracy, which is why they appealed to fascism, to dictatorship, to, as Dimitrov put it very well, I think, fascism is the most vicious and direct, brutal dictatorship of financial capital. And it's a way by which financial capital imposed its hegemony, its domination, both over the working class and over the rival factions within the capitalist class. Sorry for this detour, but
no,
I wanted to explain that fascism was at the end of the day a very extreme form of capitalism, despite what some politically illiterate right-wingers think that, oh, it was a form of socialism because the Nazis were actually the National Socialist Party and all these kind of empty rhetorical devices. The fact is that they were the most brutal expression of capitalist class interests. And this is where they are willing to go to preserve their system. Fascism, war, global climate change catastrophe, and so on.
As a continuation to the discussion, I would ask you, what are some new directions do you see for the leftist movement? I'm interested in all domains, philosophical, political, and economical. And with the mention that isn't that clear that grassroots movement that we've seen so far, that never scale up. So do you see a new form of organization, and what are the philosophical implications, political and economical implications for them? And have you noticed anything so far?
Yes, I think we are in a process of reconstruction that is very analogous, similar to the process of the second part of the 19th century, the last few decades of the 19th century, early 20th century, when the historical parties of the working class were built, social democratic, which were quite radical at the time, and the big trade unions were built, and the big workers' associations, and an entire social infrastructure of the working class was built over a period of decades. And that included, Sunday schools for workers' children, and sports clubs, and self-taught reading circles, and all this kind of social infrastructure that now is either lacking, has been destroyed by 45 years of neoliberalism, or has been eroded significantly. So the trade unions obviously are still around, but I think they are substantially weaker, both politically. They have internalized a lot of the neoliberal market logic, and also quantitatively, they are smaller. They have fewer members. And that's reflected also on the political left, as we've discussed already. So I think we are in a historical process of reconstruction that will not be identical with the one from 100, 150 years ago, but we have to repeat some of those processes.
What are exactly those? What do you think we should recover?
So I think that the grassroots movements, it's from the grassroots movement that old political left and the old organizations of the working class emerged eventually. Because if you don't give an organizational structure to these movements, then they will, vanish in thin air. Even if they accomplish something, some of the immediate demands or the single issue demands that they have, they will just dissipate if they don't, if we don't manage to galvanize that energy into more long-term political structures. And this is where the political structures will come from. I don't have any faith in the current organizations of the political left. I think we have to put our faith in the bottom-up grassroots movements, and the one we can see today in support of Palestine, in solidarity with Palestine, which is a grassroots movement. It's an international movement, gives me more hope than anything on the left in the last few years, to be honest. But we cannot stay there, like you said, Marius. We saw it before in the past with Occupy movement, with the Indignados movement in Europe, which had counterparts in different European countries. If those movements don't produce their own political organizations and projects, then they will fail on the long term to challenge neoliberalism. And in some cases, they managed to produce those political projects. In Spain, we had Podemos that was built at least partly on the Indignados movement. Unfortunately, Podemos
already failed. I think already failed as a movement.
Yeah, it failed, and then some sections of that movement realized that they could not achieve more through a social movement. They realized that they needed to organize themselves politically and got involved in the creation of Podemos. Unfortunately, Podemos is an example of a prime example of what I would call the neo-reformist left, which thinks it can challenge the neoliberal status quo through the capitalist system, through the institutional framework of the capitalist system, which is parliamentary democracy. And it abandoned the grassroots movement. It abandoned the streets and focused entirely on institutional politics and mainstream politics, elections and negotiations and this kind of politics that is designed to serve the interests of the capitalist class. You cannot defeat them by playing their game, according to their rules. That's why I think, on the one hand, a grassroots movement is not sufficient, but it's necessary. And even once you have a political party in place, it still needs that grassroots movements to push it forward and to keep it accountable and to make sure that the political party doesn't degenerate in an undemocratic and bureaucratic and reformist direction. This concept of party movement or movement party, this dual nature of what a socialist party should be, both a movement and a party. I think this captures the best the kind of left that we need to build today.
Yeah, maybe it's a dialectical nature of this
absolutely, and this brings us to the philosophical implication dimension of your question, which is dialectics. If we need to do anything, I think we need to relearn dialectics as socialists, and how the dialectics between the objective factors, the economic material situation in the global capitalism today, and the subjective factors, which is the level of consciousness of the people and the leadership of our movement, the dialectics between that, the dialectics between the national and the international, between all this, between movement and party, between the rank and file and the leadership, because I don't believe in a horizontalist model. I believe that we do need a leadership, and we do need a centralized structure. But at the same time, it should not be detached from the rank and file. They should be in a permanent dialectical relationship. So I think, from a philosophical point of view, I think dialectics is what we need to recover today.
Well, I see a trap here, if I can add something to it, because we had this experience with DM25, Democracy in Europe movement, which started, like you said, like a rank and file from bottom up, and ended up with a political party. It's also available for Volt. Demos in Romania, it's the same. I think they made the platform, but actually, if you follow their rhetoric, what I say it's a trap. It's something that happened with Les Gilets Jaunes. When the movement was free of any political aggregation, like party aggregation, there are elements from right, from everywhere, because the popular will is not focused in one direction, on one political direction or another. And usually these platforms, which serve like a launching tool for a party, because they usually this grassroots platform are imagined to end with a political party in the end, are made to somehow bypass, like you said, the dialectical problem. Because I'd say the example of USR in Romania, for example, Nicușor Dan, when they launched, exactly with civil association, something was not political, they said we are not right or left. We serve the public interest, we serve the people, there's no dialectical here. And this kind of speech usually permeates in all these grassroots, because at the grassroots level, people have all kinds of problems, and they tend to bypass this separation between left and right. And I said about the M25 because when Yanis Varoufakis launched the movement, he said was open even to liberal view of points. So he made some open space for everybody. Well, it can be for everybody. So you have to be leftist or not, and you actually need a discipline of the speech. I mean, you cannot build a left alternative with openness to everything. So we can do everything here.
Yeah. Without fidelity to a project. So.
Not fidelity, but how can I say, like an alchemy, like improving by own dialectics and speech. I mean, you need an aim, and I've seen this. I think it's actually it's a tool. It's a tool against left. We can hear it a lot at people who are on the right now, on the nationalist right, sovereignism, for example, who say, well, left and the right dichotomy is not actual anymore. We are fighting against globalism and some other things. So people try to make this dichotomy out of their public speech. So we don't have a left-right opposition. Now we have other problems. No, we cannot escape this opposition. Because when we talk about left, we talk about salaries, we talk about social justice, we talk about things we cannot hide in other topics. And that's why I think it's also a trap hidden here. But I'd ask you, Vladimir, in continuation of what you said about fascism, you said it was a tool used and probably made by elites. Well, in present days, we have a lot of political forces in Europe, which we are calling them fascist, like Le Pen or Viktor Orban or I don't know, Italy,
Meloni,
for example.
Yeah.
Meloni in Italy. But can we say that these are instruments, they are tools made like before, like you mentioned before? Because we can hardly say there's any leftist threat for which elite would need such tools. So are they tools created by the elites, or are they, I don't know, emanation from the grassroots? I mean, we cannot avoid this thing that people might actually like fascism in a way, like a search for an order or a strong leadership in times of insecurity. So are they emanated from the bottom up, or are they tools of the elites? Like you said,
I think they are both. And I would say that they are not fascist yet, precisely because of what you said. There is no imminent threat from the left, from the working class, from the popular classes to their system, to their social order. So for me, right-wing populism is more about the other axis of struggle, which is the horizontal axis within the capitalist class. between different factions of the elites, between the different factions of the ruling class, which was an axis that was present in the previous case, historical period of fascism, as I mentioned, the struggle for hegemony between different factions of capital. But the main axis was the class struggle axis between the working class and the capitalist class that could not be resolved otherwise in favor of the ruling class, otherwise than through fascism. Today, they don't need to do that because, like you say, the pressure from below is not as strong as it was 100 years ago. You don't have a revolutionary situation around the corner. You don't have mass communist parties like you had 100 years ago in Germany. You don't have a radicalized, politically conscious and militant working class like you had then. So this is the rise of right-wing populism, as I understand it, is an elite project from those factions of the capitalist class that have lost out from neoliberal globalization. Because neoliberal globalization obviously is a capitalist project, but has benefited particular factions of the capitalist class more than others. It has benefited financial capital more than it benefited industrial capital. It's benefited big business more than it benefited small and medium enterprises that have been decimated by the financialization of capitalism, by the crisis of financial capitalism, and so on. It's benefited transnational corporation over domestic capitalist classes, the domestic bourgeoisies. And if we look at the original populists, the right-wing populists like Orban, who are they? They are the representatives of the domestic bourgeoisie, in the case of Hungary, the Hungarian bourgeoisie, that needed some kind of political vehicle to promote its interests against the hegemonic foreign capital. And Orban managed to find a balance, like in a truly Bonapartist way. You know, that's the Bonapartist. That's why he's not a fascist. He's a Bonapartist, the authoritarian figure, because he manages to find a balance between different competing social blocs. And he is the main representative of Hungarian capitalists who have recovered some of their domination over construction sector, even some part of the financial sector, even some part of the energy sector. But at the same time, he had to make some concessions to other sectors that are dominated by foreign capital, such as the car industry sector, which is still 100% dominated by German companies, which are very supportive of Orban. They give him political donations when there are elections. And there was a poll, a survey among the German investors in Hungary a few years ago, and 90% or something like that said that they would vote for Orban if they would have the right to vote. So he managed to find a delicate balance between representing the interests of domestic capital and those, you know, keeping happy the foreign companies. And we have this kind of rise of right-wing populism in Italy, in Germany with the AfD, in France with Le Pen, in Spain with Vox, in Portugal more recently with Chega. And if we look at the backgrounds of their party elites, despite themselves presenting to be some kind of champions of the people, you know, truly representative of the ordinary folk and so on, they have super elite backgrounds, some of them. In Vox, for example, in Spain, some of them come from long aristocratic families that had colonies in Latin America and stuff like that, you know? So they come from super elite backgrounds, but they just come from a different faction of the elite than the dominant one that is represented by the mainstream parties, like PP in the case of Spain, the Popular Party. Their center-right is quite right-wing now. But you know what I mean. So basically, this is a struggle for hegemony between different factions of the ruling class, and the right-wing populism is a political expression of that struggle for hegemony.
Yeah, but I think it's also a charm, a public charm from fascists, because we cannot,
yes.
we cannot deny that when Germany was under fascism, Hitler had a lot of support. I mean, we all have these myths that Hitler had charisma, which was extraordinary, and people were hypnotized by him. But it was actually support from the people, and we see this see this now in Europe, that it's a lot of support for war. I mean, it's not war now. I mean, Europe had wars from Iraq, from the fall of USSR. We had wars in many places. Now, for the first time, is in Europe. But it's a great enthusiasm for this war. I mean, people had all of we have to fight there. We have to stop somebody or somebody else. So
I think there are two different issues here, and I realize I only answered half of your question. Yeah, there is popular support for these forces. So a political party is always two things. Now it's leadership, it's elites, and from this point of view, I think these forces are political projects of this, let's say, outsider factions of the capitalist class. But a party is also its voting base. Who are the people that these parties try to lean on in order to gain votes and to win power in elections? And they tend to be, of course, disillusioned voters from the ex-industrial areas, like in northern France, now the classic example of former industrial areas in northern France who voted Communist Party 40 years ago. Now they vote Le Pen. But these are not the main social base of these parties. The main social base are the proletarianized, declassed sections of the middle class, of the petite bourgeoisie. All those small and medium entrepreneurs were decimated by the crisis, decimated by COVID, decimated by the impact of the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis and the living cost crisis more widely, and all the bailouts of big business and of banks. And these layers of the petite bourgeoisie, they are the core of the social base of these far-right populist parties, just like they were back in the day. In fact, the Nazi party, its base, its electoral base was built around the petite bourgeoisie, the shopkeepers, you know, your traditional proverbial shopkeeper, who had lost everything because of the big crisis from the late 20s, early 30s. They were the main electorate of the Nazis. The working class was overwhelmingly voting for either the Communist Party or the Social Democratic Party. And to secure the support or let's say, the obedience of the working class, the Nazis had first to eliminate thousands and thousands and thousands of working class activists, and Social Democrats and Communists were the first to perish in the Nazi extermination camps. And that's when they were able to exert their domination properly, because they eliminated the opposition, which was a working class opposition in the first place.
And it's not much discussed, this aspect, historical aspect. It's some kind of neglected.
Of course,
yeah,
of course, because it would defeat, among other things, it would undermine this liberal narrative about how the Nazis were socialists. You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
if the proletarian is not voting, I mean, we don't have leftist parties anymore. I think we said before, the European left, for example, the parliament group has 5% in last elections. So the proletarian who are voting, where their votes go?
They vote for the abstention party across the Western world, but even in Eastern Europe, all the longitudinal data shows us that over the past 35, 40 years of neoliberalism, the working classes have been increasingly demobilized politically. They don't vote. The biggest chunk of the working class electorate doesn't vote for populist right, doesn't vote for social democrats or whatever, they don't vote. So they've been completely disillusioned by, and this is where a left worthy of the name needs to focus its attention on, because you have this potential huge electorate from the working class that is not on the side of any party at the moment and can be won over by a strong militant left.
I'd like to quote from your book a fragment which I think is very relevant now, from your book Crisis, Austerity and Transnational Party Cooperation. It goes like that: all parties had emerged in reaction to a gap on the left in their countries, in between a neoliberalized social democracy and an ossified communist party. That was also reflected in their neo-reformist program that, in contrast to the radical label commonly attached to these parties, advocates for what is more or less a classic social democratic agenda focused on the defense of social rights, public services, and the welfare state, coupled with new left themes such as gender equality and the environment. So can we, like you said about this huge public, the proletarians, if you can still call them like that, how can we imagine a party between these extremes? I mean, what should they how should such a party look like to address this public which is don't find themselves anywhere?
I think it has to start with its top priority, not to stand candidates in elections. I think this is a trademark of reformist parties, that their overemphasis on elections and electoral process, because this reflects their belief that social change is done through the institutions of capitalist democracy, which is a dead end. I think the priority has to be on building or rebuilding organic links to these popular classes, to these demobilized and disillusioned popular classes. And you do this in a number of ways, through grassroots campaigning, through strikes, through trying to help unionize these sections of the working class that are currently ununionized. There are a number of ways, from reading circles to demonstrations on specific issues that concern these people, like the right to housing, which is a major issue in most countries these days, that disproportionately affect the working classes. So I think we need to rebuild these organic links. I think we need to come up with a political program that manages to connect these immediate struggles on the biggest priorities facing ordinary people to the bigger struggle against capitalism and for socialism, and show that there is a necessary link there, that we cannot solve these immediate concrete problems on a long term if we don't overcome capitalism. I think we need to build internal democratic structures to avoid the degeneration of the leadership in a bureaucratic reformist direction, leadership that will sell out at the first challenge, like unfortunately Syriza did almost 10 years ago. And I think we need also internationalism. We need to realize we are not in this struggle alone. And not because it's nice to be brothers across borders, this beautiful humanism, which I believe in. But fundamentally, it's an objective necessity. We cannot defeat a global system if we don't organize globally, if we don't organize internationally. And that's why I think this movement for Palestine is much more than about Palestine. It's about building an international consciousness. And where there's an oppression and an injustice happening in any corner of the world, then we all have to react to that and organize around that, And this can help build an international movement that can go beyond a single issue or another and become a project in the fight for socialism.
Well, I try to avoid this topic about Palestine because everybody's talking about, so I don't think we can bring anything new to it. But I'd like to present just a quote. Yesterday was a conference organized by PSUV, the Socialist Party from Venezuela. And they had a representative from Palestine, Maher Taha, if I'm pronouncing correct, which said, I'm quoting, "It is not Israel that waged this war, but the US. War is waged by the West, led by the US." So I think it's like an elephant in the room, because Western countries, I mean European and also US, we are all democracies. So actually what happens with our foreign politics, it's an expression of our choices. So I think we should all of us ask about if a problem, if we see a problem and we have an opinion on Palestine, for example, why we are not forcing our governments to, so electing other people to do our bidding on those matters. So it's not Israel that it's solely culpable about this, but also the people who are electing and which are doing the foreign policy we are witnessing, and I mean protesting and this kind of grassroots in universities is not enough. If we don't change the politicians, will happen like Gilets jaunes. We had the protest and Macron was back in seat. Was nothing to do about it.
I agree. I totally agree. It's that's why I said the movement for Palestine is more than about Palestine. It's a movement that can open up the discussion and the debate and broaden consciousness on other big issues or more structural issues like imperialism, inter-imperialist tensions. In this case, between United States and China, which Palestine, if you want, is a marginal element of that. But we have to place it in this broader context of the increasing inter-imperialist tensions in the world today. It opens up questions about representativity, because you said earlier that people might want war. I don't agree there, because it's the elites certain elites who want war. Most people, ordinary people in most European countries, don't want war. They don't want NATO to go to war with Russia. They don't want. They want a ceasefire in Gaza. In Britain, for example, a survey from even a few months ago, before some of the biggest atrocities committed by Israel there were revealed to the public, early days in Israel's intervention in Gaza, the majority of the British public wanted a ceasefire. They didn't want war, and they didn't want the British government to keep arming Israel. But the political establishment is so detached from the popular will that it doesn't listen to what the people want. And it's united in its uncritical support for whatever Israel does. And this brings difficult questions of democracy under capitalism. Is this real democracy if you have this gap between what the people want and what the elites want? I don't think so. So this brings us back to what you said. We need to vote for different elites, but we first need to create those different elites. These different elites to vote for, they are not there in some cases. We don't have political elites that represent us because we don't have the political forces. We have to rebuild those political forces that represent the popular classes. And yeah, of course, the grassroots movements are not a sufficient condition for that. I agree with you. Grassroots struggles and movements like the ones in support of Palestine, but others as well. For example, here in the UK, over the past 1 year and a half, 2 years, we've seen the biggest wave of strikes in the last 30 years on the background of the living cost crisis, or on the background of profit-driven inflation and stagnation of real wages, or even decrease of real wages. And all these struggles on their own are obviously not a sufficient condition, but they are a necessary condition to build a more long-term political project. So I think that we as socialists, we need to intervene in these struggles, in these movements, and try to link the immediate demands of these movements to the broader objectives that we have as a socialist movement.
Yes, you said about the transnational cooperation between parties. You meant only the level of European parties, or a broader cooperation? I mean, like, we have the example of left parties in South America, which are very successful now and have a long history of struggle. So you mean you are meaning broader cooperation, or just cooperation at the level of Europe?
Oh, broader cooperation. Obviously, at a regional level, in this case, European level, it makes sense to have more intense cooperation because you operate in the same space of the European Union with common legislation, no common policies, common challenges. You have common elections now coming up, European elections. So it makes more sense to have a more integrated coordination of left forces. But this has to be a global struggle, a global movement. And if you remember the Podemos ideological roots were in Latin America. Their kind of emulation was coming from the left populist regimes in Latin America, which had many problems, and Podemos imported some of those inbuilt issues. But it just shows that this kind of diffusion and cooperation goes beyond Europe. And going back to the Third International now, some of the future leaders of the liberation movements in the anti-colonial struggles from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s were forged in those meetings and in that cooperation of the Third International. So I think today even more so we have the need and the opportunity to have a global wide cooperation and coordination on the left.
Well, because I asked you, because the European Left Party, for example, in previous elections in Venezuela, they didn't recognize the election and they distanced themselves. There were only 2 members from the European Left family who participated, and they went independent of the parliamentary group. I mean, Claire Daly and Mick Wallace. But the European Left disapproved the presidential, were parliament elections, I think. So there is a problem between, let's say, a geopolitical problem, which separate the European left from the left from other countries.
Yes, I think that's, I don't know the details of that exactly and what was the position taken by the European Left Party on that, but I think we need to be able to criticize the problems with those regimes, like in Venezuela, and the bureaucratic tendencies of those regimes. And to be honest, the failure to fundamentally challenge the capitalist system. Venezuela is still a capitalist country, even though the state plays a bigger role than in other capitalist countries. It's not a socialist country. It's a capitalist economy where the state indeed plays a bigger role, but it's a state capitalist type of society. And at the same time, oppose completely the reactionary opposition to those regimes, the kind of US imperialist interests that opposition serves. We know what would happen if the right-wing opposition would come to power in Venezuela. The transnational American corporations would come back, would regain their influence and their control of the resources of Venezuela. So I think we can do both. We don't have to choose between one or the other. As socialists, we have to take a principled and independent position and criticize both the imperialist reactionary side and the bureaucratic authoritarian regime.
Thank you. I think we can end with talking about what happened this Sunday, because we'll have elections. We'll have elections at the European level, which is very important for what Europe still is, and what its meaning for the meaning for its future would be. And also elections in Romania, local elections. A bit later, we'll have elections also for parliament here. in the elections in many other places. We'll have also a very heated campaign in the Republic of Moldavia, which I think will be this autumn, and I think will be very interesting. But let's end with this subject. How you see this this election? I mean, can you say like about the European elections and the local elections? A thought on them.
I mean, to start with the local elections, I mean, let's say the elections in Romania, unfortunately, despite the fact that I think there is a significant potential left-wing electorate that could be mobilized by a left-wing party, we don't have the party to do that. And all the parties on the mainstream of Romanian politics represent different factions of the capitalist class in Romania. Some maybe more on the side of foreign capital, others more on the side of Romanian capitalist class, but none of them is truly a vehicle for the interests of popular classes in Romania. So we are left without an option. And I think, again, the abstention party will win again, especially among the poorer layers in society and the more precarious layers in society. But I think the hope for us is to look and focus on the extra parliamentary avenues of struggle. And at the European level, again, it looks pretty bleak. The far right is set to make the biggest gains ever in European elections. I'm not sure how important these elections are. I'm not sure how important the European Parliament is in the balance of forces at the EU level. But clearly, if the far right, especially the far right, there are two far right blocs, as you know, now in the European Parliament, one led by Meloni, the other one led by Le Pen, who don't seem to see eye to eye. I think Meloni is more willing to play along this kind of business as usual lines, and she's more pro-NATO, she's more pro-EU than Le Pen. But if they manage to find a way to come together, I think we are set for maybe the most reactionary EU Parliament and EU Commission. As we know, the composition of the Commission depends on the balance of forces in the European Parliament, in the history of European Union, which is ironic considering that the EU was given as this protection against the rise of far right. No, we need to stick with the EU. We need to defend the EU. You had this debate here in Britain during Brexit. We need to defend the EU because they will be a bulwark against the rise of far right. Well, no, they are a fertile ground and for the rise of the far right. And we see the mainstream forces in European Parliament, like the Popular Party and Ursula von der Leyen, very, very open to collaborating with the far right. So they are actually emboldening the far right rather than preventing its rise.
Thank you, Vladimir. It was a very interesting debate, I think. We could have continued for an extra hour, I think.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
if you are okay, I think we can make a further next debate, maybe after elections, when we can say certainly what happened, and the effects probably will already be visible by then. So thank you again, and we should see you next time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you guys. And just to finish on an optimistic note, like Gramsci put it, the pessimism of the intellect has to be combined with the optimism of the heart. I think because of this lack of alternatives and options and this competition between different rights representing different sections of the ruling class, that's even more imperative that we build a truly socialist alternative to this establishment.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.